It was a hot, sticky afternoon in the middle of summer. The kind of day where the heat seemed to cling to everything, making even the simplest tasks feel unbearable. The sun blazed high in the sky, casting sharp shadows across the city streets. Cars rumbled by, and the hum of distant conversation filled the air as people went about their day. In the midst of it all, a young boy named Ethan sat on the steps outside his school, clutching his lunch bag. Ethan was 11 years old, with a mop of sandy brown hair and a curious, kind-hearted nature. He lived in a small apartment with his mother, who worked long hours as a nurse at the local hospital. They didn't have much, but they got by, and his mother always made sure he had enough to eat. Today, though, Ethan wasn't particularly hungry. His mother had packed him his favorite sandwich, peanut butter and jelly, along with an apple and a carton of milk, but the heat had sapped his appetite. He was about to tuck the sandwich back into the bag when something caught his eye. A man was sitting on the curb across the street. His clothes were ragged, his hair unkempt, and his face was weathered, with deep lines that spoke of a life far harder than any child could imagine. He sat slumped over, staring at the ground, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. Passers-by hurried past him, not even sparing a glance in his direction. Ethan watched the man for a moment, his young mind trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He had seen homeless people before, but something about this man tugged at his heart. Maybe it was the way he sat, so still and defeated. Or maybe it was the way his hollow eyes seemed to search for something, anything to hold on to. Without thinking twice, Ethan stood up, grabbed his lunch bag, and crossed the street. "Excuse me," Ethan said hesitantly as he approached the man. The man didn't respond at first, but after a moment he lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face was drawn and gaunt. He looked at the boy with a mixture of surprise and confusion, as if he couldn't quite believe someone was speaking to him. Ethan held out his lunch bag. "You look hungry. I'm not that hungry today, so you can have this if you want." The man stared at the bag, his eyes widening slightly. For a long moment he said nothing, as if he couldn't comprehend the boy's offer. Then slowly he reached out with trembling hands and took the bag from Ethan's outstretched hand. "Thank you," the man whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible. Ethan smiled. "You're welcome. I hope it helps." The man nodded, but he didn't say anything else. He simply sat there, holding the bag in his lap, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, unsure of what else to say. Then, with a wave, he turned and headed back across the street, leaving the man to his meal. As he walked back to the school, Ethan felt a strange warmth in his chest. He didn't know much about the man or what had brought him to such a difficult place in life, but in that moment he had done something kind, and it felt good. He didn't know that this small act of kindness would come back to him years later, in ways he could never have imagined. 15 years went by. Ethan grew up, went to high school, and eventually left for college. He studied business administration and quickly found his way into the corporate world after graduation. With hard work, determination, and a bit of luck, Ethan landed a job at a successful investment firm. His career took off, and before long, he found himself climbing the ranks, earning more money than he ever thought possible as a kid. But even as his career thrived, Ethan never forgot his humble beginnings. He always remembered the lessons his mother had taught him about kindness, generosity, and the importance of helping those in need. That brief encounter with the homeless man on the curb all those years ago had stuck with him, a reminder that even small acts of compassion could make a world of difference to someone. One afternoon, Ethan was sitting at his desk in his sleek, modern office, overlooking the bustling city below. He had just finished a meeting with some high-profile clients and was about to head home when his phone rang. "Ethan," came the familiar voice of his assistant, Hannah. "There's a man here who says he has an appointment with you. He doesn't seem to have an official meeting on the schedule, but he insists that you'll want to see him." Ethan frowned, confused. "Who is it?" "He says his name is Mr. Carter," Hannah replied. "He wouldn't say much else, but he seems insistent." Ethan thought for a moment. He didn't recognize the name, but something about the way Hannah described the man made him curious. "All right," Ethan said. "Send him in." Moments later, the door to Ethan's office opened, and in walked an older man, perhaps in his late 50s or early 60s. He wore a well-tailored suit, and his silver hair was neatly combed. He had an air of quiet confidence, but there was something in his eyes, something that seemed oddly familiar. The man smiled warmly as he stepped forward. "Ethan, it's good to see you again. You probably don't remember me, but we met a long time ago." Ethan stood up from his desk, extending his hand to shake the man's. "Mr. Carter, you say?" "I'm sorry. I can't quite place where we've met." The man chuckled softly. "That's understandable. It was many years ago. I wasn't in the best shape back then. In fact, I was at my lowest point, sitting on a curb outside a school, starving and hopeless." Ethan's eyes widened, and a rush of memories flooded back to him. The man on the curb, the one he had given his lunch to when he was just a boy. Could it be? "You were the man I gave my lunch to?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Mr. Carter nodded. "Yes, that was me. I never forgot that day. You have no idea how much that simple act of kindness meant to me at the time." Ethan was speechless. He had never expected to see the man again, let alone in such different circumstances. The last time he had seen him, Mr. Carter had been homeless, starving, and hopeless. But now he looked like a completely different person, healthy, successful, and full of life. I don't know what to say," Ethan stammered. "You seem to be doing well now." Mr. Carter smiled. "I am, thanks to you. You see, that day, I was at the end of my rope. I had lost everything. My job, my home, my family. I was sitting on that curb wondering if life was even worth living anymore. And then you came along, this little boy with a kind heart, offering me something as simple as a sandwich. It wasn't just the food that saved me. It was the fact that someone cared." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat as he listened to Mr. Carter's words. He had never realized just how much that small act of kindness had meant. "That day, after you gave me your lunch, I made a decision," Mr. Carter continued. "I decided to turn my life around. I checked myself into a shelter, started going to support groups, and eventually found work. It wasn't easy, but little by little I rebuilt my life. And now I'm the CEO of a non-profit organization that helps homeless individuals get back on their feet, just like I did." Ethan was stunned. "You're the CEO of a non-profit?" Mr. Carter nodded. "Yes, it's called Second Chances. We provide housing, job training, and mental health support to people who are struggling, just like I was. And I've come here today because I wanted to thank you personally and because I have a proposal for you." Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A proposal?" Mr. Carter smiled again, this time with a glint of excitement in his eyes. "Yes, I know you're a successful businessman now, and I've heard great things about your work. I'd like to partner with you. Second Chances is growing, and we need someone with your skills to help us manage the financial side of things. I think together we could make an even bigger impact." Ethan was taken aback. He had always dreamed of giving back in a meaningful way, but he had never expected an opportunity like this to fall into his lap. And the fact that it was tied to a man he had helped so many years ago made it all the more surreal. "I don't know what to say," Ethan said, still trying to process everything. "This is incredible." Mr. Carter leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Ethan, you changed my life with that one small act of kindness. You gave me hope when I had none left. Now, I'm offering you the chance to help others in the same way. What do you say?" Ethan didn't need much time to think it over. The opportunity to work with Second Chances felt like a calling, something he couldn't ignore. He had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, earning money and prestige, but there was a part of him that had always longed to do something more meaningful. This was his chance to make a real difference. Within weeks, Ethan joined Second Chances as their financial advisor, helping Mr. Carter and his team manage the non-profit's growing resources. The organization provided housing, job training, and mental health support to hundreds of homeless individuals, giving them the tools they needed to rebuild their lives. Ethan threw himself into the work, finding fulfillment in helping others. It was a far cry from the corporate world he had come from, but it felt right. He knew that every dollar he helped raise, every resource he helped allocate, was going toward changing lives, just like Mr. Carter's life had been changed. Over time, Ethan and Mr. Carter became close friends, bonded by their shared history and their commitment to the mission of Second Chances. Together, they expanded the non-profit's reach, opening new shelters, offering more programs, and partnering with local businesses to provide job opportunities for those in need. The work wasn't always easy. There were challenges: funding shortfalls, bureaucratic red tape, and the emotional toll of seeing so many people in pain. But through it all, Ethan remained committed to the cause. He knew that every setback was worth it if it meant giving someone a second chance at life. Years passed, and Second Chances continued to grow. The organization had helped thousands of people by the time Ethan and Mr. Carter found themselves sitting together in a quiet cafe, reminiscing about the journey they had been on. "I still can't believe how far we've come," Ethan said, sipping his coffee. "It feels like just yesterday I was sitting on those school steps, handing you my lunch." Mr. Carter smiled warmly. "You never know how one small moment can change everything. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be sitting here today." Ethan shook his head. "I think you would have found a way. You're a strong man." Mr. Carter looked down at his coffee for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he looked up at Ethan with a serious expression. "There's something I've never told you, Ethan," he said quietly. "Something that I think you deserve to know." Ethan frowned, his curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Mr. Carter took a deep breath. "You weren't just a random boy who crossed my path that day. I knew who you were." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Mr. Carter hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Years before I met you, I had a family, a wife and a son. I was doing well back then, running my own business, but I made some bad decisions, got involved with the wrong people, and everything fell apart. I lost my business, my home, and eventually my family." Ethan listened, trying to piece together where this was going. "When my wife left me, she took our son with her. I never saw him again," Mr. Carter continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I searched for them for years, but they disappeared. I spiraled after that, and that's how I ended up on the streets." Ethan's stomach churned with unease. There was something familiar about the way Mr. Carter was talking, something that made his heart race. "Ethan," Mr. Carter said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you're my son." The words hung in the air, heavy and shocking. Ethan stared at Mr. Carter, his mind racing as he tried to process what he had just heard. "No," Ethan whispered, shaking his head. "That can't be true." Mr. Carter's eyes filled with tears as he reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photograph. He handed it to Ethan, his hands trembling. Ethan looked down at the photo. It was a picture of a young couple, Mr. Carter and a woman with bright eyes and a warm smile. In her arms was a baby boy, no older than a year. "That's you," Mr. Carter said softly, "and that's your mother." Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the photo. The woman in the picture, his mother, looked exactly like she had in the old family photos he had seen growing up. And the baby, it was him. "This can't be real," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "My mother never told me about you. She said my father. She said he died." Mr. Carter's face crumpled with sorrow. "I never wanted to leave you, Ethan. Your mother and I had our problems, but I loved you both more than anything. After she left, I tried to find you, but I was too late. She had changed her name, moved to a different city. I didn't know where to start." Ethan felt a wave of anger and confusion wash over him. His entire life had been built on a lie. The man sitting across from him, the man he had once thought was a stranger, was his father. The father he had been told was dead. "I don't know what to say," Ethan murmured, his mind reeling. "I'm so sorry," Mr. Carter said, tears streaming down his face. "I know I failed you. I should have been there for you and your mother. But I was lost, Ethan. I didn't know how to find my way back. And then, when I met you that day, I had no idea you were my son until I saw your mother's picture years later, when I finally found her again." Ethan sat in stunned silence, his mind swirling with emotions. How could he reconcile this? The man he had helped so many years ago, the man who had been such a central figure in his life recently, was his own father. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Mr. Carter said, his voice barely audible. "But I wanted you to know the truth. I needed you to know that I've always loved you, even when I didn't know how to show it." Ethan looked up, meeting his father's tearful gaze. His emotions were a tangled mess of anger, confusion, and sorrow. But beneath it all, there was something else, a flicker of understanding. His father had made terrible mistakes, but he had also spent years trying to make amends, helping countless others in the process. "I don't know how to feel right now," Ethan admitted, his voice trembling. "But I'm glad you told me." Mr. Carter nodded, wiping away his tears. "I understand. Take all the time you need." For a long time they sat in silence, the weight of the revelation hanging between them. It was a lot to process, but as Ethan looked at the man who had once been a stranger and was now his father, he realized something important. Life was full of unexpected twists and turns. It was messy, complicated, and often painful. But even in the darkest moments, there was always a chance for redemption, for healing, and for second chances. And in that moment, Ethan knew that he had been given his own second chance, a chance to rebuild the relationship he had never known he was missing. In the weeks and months that followed, Ethan and Mr. Carter began to rebuild their relationship. It wasn't easy. There were years of pain and loss to work through, but they were both committed to healing the wounds of the past. Together, they continued to grow second chances, helping even more people rebuild their lives, just as they were rebuilding theirs. The nonprofit flourished, and soon it became a national organization, with shelters and programs across the country. Ethan never forgot the moment when he offered his lunch to a starving man on the curb all those years ago. It had seemed like such a small act of kindness at the time, but it had set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. And in the end, he learned that the man he had helped was not just a stranger in need. He was his father, a man who had been lost but was now found. Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. A small act of kindness, like offering a meal to a hungry stranger, can ripple through time in ways we can't even imagine. For Ethan, that moment of compassion brought him full circle, reuniting him with the father he never knew. It's a reminder that every act of kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change lives, including our own. If you enjoyed this story, YouTube thinks you'll like these stories also.